Have you ever wondered what it would be like to be singled out in the middle of a family party, with everyone looking at you as if you were guilty of something unforgivable? No matter how hard you try to please, there are times when no one is truly willing to listen. I remember the feeling of stepping into that house, the smell of food mixed with forced laughter and quick glances that avoided meeting mine. Every corner seemed to be filled with a muffled conversation, a snide comment, and the worst part was knowing that, at any moment, everything could spiral out of control. I couldn't relax. My breathing felt different, my hands clammy, and my thoughts were spinning. It was there, on that Saturday that promised to be just another family night, that everything changed. I just wanted to go unnoticed, but one sentence was all it took to become a target of mockery, laughter, and accusations. It wasn't just embarrassment. It was the pain of trusting the one I thought was on my side, only to suddenly discover that you're completely alone on the battlefield. If someone had told me that night would end with my dignity being trampled, I wouldn't have believed them. But none of this started with a public attack. Before I tell you how I was called a witch in front of everyone, you need to understand how it all started. I was born in Springfield, Illinois, on March 15, 1967. If someone had asked my age at that party, I would have said 57. But the truth is, deep down at that moment, I felt much older than that. I was raised alone by my mother, Mary, a woman who never bowed her head to anyone. She worked at a local elementary school, was known for standing up to principals and neighbors without losing her composure, and always insisted that dignity was what no one could take from us. I had no brothers, so I grew up hearing stories of strong women, listening to advice at the kitchen table while she stirred the pasta sauce. This has left its mark on me in a way that's hard to explain to someone who hasn't had to fight for respect from an early age. I spent my life in libraries, school hallways, dusty old archives, and hastily written student papers. I graduated with a history degree from the University of Chicago in 1989 and taught for over 30 years. I chose to retire after the books closed, and my patience with the administration ran out. The diploma hanging on my office wall never made me forget who I was. It only served as a reminder of how hard I fought to find my place, even when no one expected anything of me. I met Daniel in 2003 in a downtown bookstore. He was a project manager for a tech company, 10 years older than me, divorced, and already had 2 adult children, Mark and Susan, who rarely called or showed up on holidays. We moved to Seattle in 2005, a gray city with wide streets and a quietness unlike that of rural Illinois. His family lived mostly nearby, except for his younger brother, who had moved away due to a long-standing feud with his mother-in-law. It was in that environment that I became part of that family nucleus. The routine was made up of parties, birthdays, weddings, Sunday lunches, always surrounded by the same faces, the same stories repeated at the table, the smell of fresh coffee in the dining room of her mother-in-law, Mrs. 90, firm, her hair always tied in a bun, and a voice that seemed to cut through the atmosphere. She commanded every gathering, from the menu to the place setting. When I arrived, I quickly realized that her children and grandchildren listened more to their mother than anyone else. No one disputed her decisions, and when someone ventured a sarcastic comment, she was quick to respond. She didn't use sweet words. If she wanted to say someone was a burden, she said so. If she thought someone wasn't good for the family business, she said so in front of everyone. Over time, I learned to read the looks. Mark, the eldest son, always avoiding conflict, pretended to laugh at his mother's jokes to avoid being the next target. Susan, the middle daughter, was cold and distant, greeting me only to avoid hearing complaints, and the grandchildren cowered in their chairs, waiting for the right moment to leave the room. Only Daniel, at first, tried to be a bridge between his mother and the rest of the world, but even he couldn't stop the barbs, and the barbs were never few. I interpreted the comments about the woman from abroad, Daniel's new wife, as if I were a guest I'd forgotten to leave. On important occasions, the most special dishes were always reserved for the grandchildren, and I'd help in the kitchen or sit with an empty glass, waiting for someone to remember I existed. It wasn't outright rejection. It was worse, being ignored, the target of seemingly innocent jokes that carried a venom only those who've experienced it can feel. At the first few family gatherings, I tried to respond, but I quickly realized that confronting her wouldn't solve anything. What worked was silence and observation, catching every little hostility, every awkward gesture. I became adept at pretending not to notice, just so as not to give my mother-in-law ammunition to make a bigger fuss. I remember one Christmas in 2015, when she asked me to pour everyone's wine, saying that, even for that, I had steady hands, because teaching history was for those who didn't know how to deal with real people. No one said anything, and I swallowed that sentence like so many others. Daniel saw it, but pretended not to hear, and I learned that, to survive in that family, you had to know how to keep quiet and wait. Even when Daniel tried to strike up a conversation to defend me, his mother-in-law would cut him off with a sentence, a look, or simply change the subject. I began to understand that the matriarch controlled the situation out of fear. Everyone was accustomed to keeping their heads down. No one had the courage to confront me directly. And if anyone dared to contradict me, they were treated with contempt until they apologized. It didn't take long for me to realize that this fear was passed down from generation to generation, like a silent tradition. At first, I tried to reach out to Daniel's children, invite them to lunch, offer to help when the grandchildren were sick, but there was never any real space. I was the woman who arrived too late, occupying a place that was never mine. Over time, I stopped trying to please, but I never got used to the feeling of tiptoeing around my own house. Most fights and arguments started with an unfiltered comment from my mother-in-law and ended with Daniel telling me to not take it personally. Only those who have experienced this understand what it means to swallow pride and smile to avoid a confrontation that deep down no one would have the courage to win. Life with Daniel was, for the most part, peaceful. He enjoyed reading, tinkering around the house, and didn't go out much. On cold Seattle nights, we'd often sit by the fireplace, listening to oldies or watching a random movie. These were times when I almost forgot the burden of his family, but all it took was an invitation to dinner at his mother-in-law's house for the tension to return. For years, I'd accepted the role of supporting actor to keep the peace. Until that Saturday, I thought I'd seen it all, learned to deal with every look, every awkward silence. But what was to come? There was no way to predict it. Now I want to know, have you ever had to swallow your pride just to keep the peace in your family? What would your reaction have been in my shoes? Would you face everything head-on or stay silent, waiting for the right moment? Write in the comments below and tell me if you've ever experienced something like this. Share your story or leave a sentence that describes how you felt after hearing all this. And at that moment, I still had no idea what was about to happen. I remember exactly the moment everything went wrong. It was past 9:30 that night, at my mother-in-law's house in Bellevue. Dinner had just been served. The smell of roast beef and potatoes permeated every corner of the dining room. The clatter of silverware mingled with laughter, and suddenly, everyone raised their glasses for a toast. I stood close to Daniel, trying to appear part of that circle, even though I knew I was only there at his insistence. My mother-in-law, sitting at the head of the table, eyed each person attentively. No one spoke without her permission. After the toast, she wiped her mouth with her napkin, rested her hands on the table, and struggled to her feet. Her voice came louder than I expected, cutting off any conversation. That woman should never have entered our family. She's a shrew, a witch. The words came thick with anger, as if she'd been waiting for the right opportunity to let it out. Silence was immediate. The grandchildren stopped playing with their phones. Even Mark dropped his fork. I looked at Daniel, hoping he'd say something, but he just lowered his head. No one did anything. My face felt hot, as if I were pressed against a hot stove. I saw Susan pull away slightly, hiding her embarrassment. Some of the younger ones tried to hold back their laughter, but failed. I heard two muffled chuckles and someone whispering. The sound of my mother-in-law's voice still echoed, loud, as she stared at me unblinkingly. She repeated, "That woman is a disgrace to my son, to this family. How can they accept a stranger like that in here?" I couldn't respond. I stood there, my hand clenching my glass, trying not to let on how much it affected me. My mouth went dry, my breath short. A sick feeling settled in my stomach. It wasn't the first time she'd treated me like that, but never in front of so many people. Someone pulled back their chair, making a loud noise. Two of the nephews looked at me as if expecting a reaction, but said nothing. I heard a whisper from the other end of the table. It was something like, "Always her," followed by a low chuckle. I felt my hands grow cold. I clutched my napkin to hide it, trying to focus on anything other than the embarrassment. I saw one of my cousins look away, the other staring at his plate, hoping no one would ask his opinion. Daniel stood still, staring at the center of the table, not daring to look at me. Every second seemed to last an eternity. The clock on the wall read 9:42 when I finally managed to tear my gaze away from my mother-in-law and look around. It was as if I had ceased to exist for them. I was only remembered when someone wanted to laugh, when the mother-in-law needed a target. The rest of the group pretended not to see, because it was easier than picking a fight with the matriarch. I don't remember who started it, but soon the conversations resumed, their voices low. The atmosphere became awkward, heavy, as if every word I said could be used against me. I knew it would only get worse from there. No one there would stand up for me. It wasn't new, but it hurt all the same. I saw Susan take a photo of the table, laughing with her daughter, while her mother-in-law continued her tirade. I heard her say that when he joined the family, Daniel was respected. But then, everything became a joke. She repeated that I was a source of shame, that I had destroyed the harmony of the household. Each sentence seemed harsher than the last. I tried to focus on the glass, the shape of it, the smell of the wine, just to avoid looking at anyone. I knew that if anyone saw me crying, I'd become another joke in their collection. One of my nieces, perhaps out of pity, tried to bring up the subject of the weather, but no one responded. Deep down, everyone just wanted it to be over. I felt like getting up and leaving, but I knew I'd hand the victory to my mother-in-law. Her look was one of someone who had already won, one of someone who knew no one there had the courage to put a stop to it. My body felt heavy, but I remained seated, feigning normalcy, staring at the table as if nothing had happened. A desire to disappear completely overcame me. The shame was so great, I could barely swallow. Amidst the noise, I heard Daniel finally try to say, "Shall we change the subject?" But no one followed. The mother-in-law ignored him, continuing with a comment about how, in the old days, the women in the family knew their place. I felt the blood rush to my face, my sweaty hands clenching the napkin. Every sideways glance felt like a judgment, every laugh an attack. Time passed slowly in that room, as if each minute carried its own weight. The clock ticked, but I felt trapped there, waiting for someone to do something, anything, but no one did. And it was at that precise moment, as everyone went back to their own business, that I realized I was completely helpless there, betrayed by the one I trusted most, even by the one I thought would never leave me alone. I thought my dignity had been destroyed there, but that night was far from over. Stories like this unite us because everyone, at some point, has felt the weight of being targeted, of carrying a label they didn't ask for. This intensity cannot go unnoticed. Leave your like now. It's your way of showing that you won't accept living in silence. Subscribe to the channel to continue receiving real stories that expose what many pretend not to see. What happened there was just the beginning, and what comes next? No one in that room was prepared to face it. I sat there as the conversation slowly resumed, as if no one had heard anything. My mother-in-law laughed again, played with her grandchildren, and gave instructions on who should put away the leftovers from dinner. I forced myself to remain still, knowing that if I stood up right then, I wouldn't be able to hold back the tears. My face was still hot, my mouth dry, my throat tight. Every time someone glanced my way, I pretended not to see. I felt my hands grow cold and sweaty at the same time. The whispers came almost immediately from the left side of the table, then down the hall, near the powder room. Susan, passing me with the tray, exchanged a quick word with Mark, the two of them chuckling softly as if I weren't there. Daniel's oldest daughter said, "Sorry, see?" but continued on her way without waiting for a response. When I finally managed to get up, I went straight to the kitchen, pretending to get water just to get some air. The microwave clock read 10:16 as I began clearing the dishes, one by one, listening to the party continue on the other side of the door. Each stacked plate was a reminder that I had no voice here. The silverware clattering against the bottom of the sink made more noise than the conversations I could hear from the living room. On the counter, I saw a napkin with my name scrawled wrong. Someone had drawn a witch's hat next to it, a detail that left no doubt as to how the joke had become a norm for them. My stomach churned, and for a moment I considered dropping everything and leaving. I didn't go because I remembered my mother saying that the worst act of cowardice was bowing your head to someone who didn't respect anyone. The silence of the kitchen was the only space where I could breathe properly. I rested my hands on the counter and closed my eyes for a few seconds. In the living room, the atmosphere was different, as if nothing had happened. I heard my mother-in-law give another order, asking for dessert, ordering someone to clean the floor because one of the grandchildren had spilled soda. There was no shortage of lowbrow jokes and sidelong laughter. One of my cousins walked past me, said, "Is your broom left outside?" and left without waiting for an answer. Another asked if I knew how to make a cleaning potion and laughed at his own joke. Each comment only made me want to disappear. I wanted to respond, but nothing came of it. I remained silent, picking up the remains of dinner, taking glasses to the sink, pretending it was normal to be invisible in that house. As I washed the dishes, I replayed everything that had happened in just a few minutes. I thought about how I'd gotten there, how many times I'd accepted the role of an extra so as not to ruin the family atmosphere. The memories came rushing back, especially of conversations with my mother. She said that, in those moments, the worst option was to let it pass as if nothing had happened. I remembered a Christmas long ago, when she'd defended me from a rude neighbor, saying that women shouldn't tolerate disrespect, either inside or outside the house. I tried to draw strength from that memory, but shame overwhelmed me. The living room continued to play soft music. One of the grandchildren put on a funny video on the television. Some laughed, others exchanged messages on their phones. I stayed in the kitchen, feeling the urge to cry welling up, but I didn't let it. My body felt heavy, my legs stiff, and time was slow to pass. When I finally returned to the living room to get the last cups, no one looked me in the eye. Susan whispered something to her daughter and laughed. My mother-in-law looked over her glasses and pretended she hadn't even seen me. It was this kind of indifference that hurt the most. It wasn't just the open humiliation, it was the certainty that no one there cared. Silently, I gathered up the cups and took everything to the kitchen. I turned on the faucet and let the water run while I tried to organize my feelings. My head whirled between anger, shame, and the desire to never set foot there again. For the first time, I had no doubt. Those people never saw me as family, only as an intruder used to clean up other people's messes. As the water ran in the sink, I thought about every detail of the night, every slurred phrase, every laugh that cut off my desire to respond. When I finished, I sat on the step in the laundry room. It was 10:42. I took a deep breath and felt a bitter taste in my mouth. I looked at the empty hallway and thought, no one here feels what I'm feeling. The urge to scream was strong, but nothing came out. I stood there, motionless, remembering my mother's words, reviewing every face at that table. And for the first time, I felt an unfamiliar rage, a desire to show I wasn't as weak as they thought. I don't remember how long I stood there, but when I stood up, I was determined to never again accept that kind of contempt. The silence of that kitchen was the space where my mind began to function differently. There, with no one around, I began to think of a way to get even though I didn't know how. But it was in that silence that I began to prepare something that no one expected. The sound of the faucet echoed in my head as I tried to organize the remains of dinner in the sink. The automatic movement of stacking plates, sorting silverware, and throwing away dirty napkins was almost an excuse not to return to that crowded classroom. With each laugh that drifted through the door, my anger grew. It seemed impossible that these people had just turned me into a laughingstock, and, minutes later, were back to acting as if nothing had happened. I thought of my mother again. I remembered her standing at the school door, in her brown coat, staring down a principal who had said that women weren't cut out to teach history. Never bow your head in the face of injustice. She said this, looking me in the eye, unblinking, as if it were a law. That was what kept me from breaking down that night. I sat on the kitchen stool with a bowl still in my hands. I checked my phone. It was 10:51. Another message from Susan in the family group, probably mocking what had happened. I pretended not to see it, putting the phone aside. I heard Daniel trying to convince his brothers to stop laughing, but no one took him seriously. I heard my mother-in-law yelling from the hallway for me to remember to put the dishes away. That hit me hard, but it also served as a wake-up call. I was tired of pretending it didn't hurt. From then on, nothing would go unnoticed. Instead of responding or playing the victim, I decided to observe. I went silently to the hallway, grabbed the dish towel, and began drying the dishes, taking in every conversation, every detail. I noticed that, near the fireplace, Daniel's brother-in-law and Mark were discussing an old will. They said something about, "She won't see the color of that money," and then fell silent when they realized I was nearby. I returned to the kitchen, but now paying attention to everything around me. I noticed that, in the back office where my mother-in-law kept documents, there was a stack of envelopes on the table, some with Daniel's name on them, others with no addressee. I saw Susan carrying a small box of papers. She tried to hide it, but it was clear how she hid the box when I approached. I pretended not to notice, continuing to dry the glasses. The movement seemed random, but it wasn't. It was party night, but there was a hidden tension, a strange rush to hide things before anyone asked. My mind was on autopilot, but I was recording every detail. The living room rug was out of place, as if a piece of furniture had been pulled. On the shelf near the window was a manila envelope, sealed with red tape. I remembered hearing my mother-in-law say days before that the family lawyer would come to settle matters, but no one had ever spoken openly about it. In this house, secrecy was more valuable than any inheritance. I stood there, analyzing the gestures, the words, and the silences. A sentence from Susan's mother slipped out when she thought no one was listening. "She'll only leave here with the clothes on her back. You can bet on that." Her tone was low, but the venom was easy to detect. That night, I realized the public humiliation wasn't just a grudge, it was part of something bigger. I remembered an old argument about an expensive gift Daniel had received from his mother, which then disappeared from the house without explanation. On another birthday, I noticed his mother-in-law getting irritated when Daniel asked about his father's old car. She changed the subject, avoided the conversation. The pieces began to fall into place: the will, the missing gifts, the hidden papers. Until then, I'd been afraid of causing a stir, but now I felt different. It was no longer a matter of putting up with it out of politeness. I was no longer going to accept being used as a scapegoat. Instead of exploding right then and there, I took a deep breath, wiped my hand on my apron, and made a decision. I wasn't going to retaliate at that dinner. I wasn't going to put on a show, but I promised myself that this humiliation would be the last. From that moment on, everything changed. I sat at the kitchen table and began recalling every suspicious situation from the past few years. The lawyer's visits, my mother-in-law's offhand comments about the estate, the rush to put away documents whenever someone arrived. The more I thought, the more I noticed the pattern. They were always one step ahead, acting in silence. Only this time, I would be the one acting in silence. At that moment, I began to piece together what was really happening. I've never been one to trust other people's memories to remember what truly matters. After that night, I returned home a different person. I spent the next 3 days without exchanging more than 5 words with Daniel, limiting myself to quick questions about what needed to be done that week. I pretended to be busy, organized the closet, went through the photo albums, but inside, I was only thinking about the details that had escaped the others at that dinner. I remembered the manila envelope on my mother-in-law's shelf, the box Susan was carrying, and Mark's comment about the will. I was putting together a mental map of everything that could help me. On Monday, January 9th, I took advantage of Daniel's doctor's appointment with his mother and asked for a ride to her house. I often went there during the day to pick up something she'd forgotten, so no one thought anything of it strange when I arrived just before lunch. I brought an apple pie, left it in the kitchen, and said I was going to the bathroom. That was all the time I needed to walk down the hallway and check out the office. I didn't want to risk forcing anything open, but I noticed the bottom drawer of the cabinet was just ajar. I pretended to be looking for toilet paper, opened it slowly, and immediately found 2 envelopes, one with bank statements and the other with transfer of ownership papers. I read them quickly, jotting down the names, dates, and amounts. I used the cell phone hidden in my pocket to take 2 photos of each page. I was there for less than 3 minutes, but it was enough to understand that those movements weren't just bureaucracy. The next day, Susan commented on the family group about an inventory, saying it was all to avoid future confusion. But the documents I saw said otherwise. There were forged signatures, incorrect dates, and most importantly, a donation deed made in Mark's name, dated November 22nd, 2022. No one had mentioned that donation during Sunday lunch. I immediately realized they were trying to bypass Daniel, removing his name from the assets his mother-in-law promised to divide among them all. Instead of facing the problem head-on, the family acted quietly, trusting me to remain silent and lost. Over the next few days, I continued to feign normalcy. Whenever someone asked for help tidying up their mother-in-law's office or cleaning out the basement, I went. On each visit, I took the opportunity to examine the papers stored in plastic boxes, check old folders, and search for documents. Even as a teacher, I learned to spot small frauds, different initials, misplaced stamps, dates overwritten with correction fluid. I photographed everything, sending the images to an email address I'd created specifically for this purpose, out of reach of my family. When I needed a physical copy, I used the printer at the local supermarket, a block away, and always paid in cash to avoid leaving a trace. I spoke indirectly with the secretary of the lawyer who handled my mother-in-law's interests. I went to the office under the pretext of bringing some documents for Daniel to sign and brought up the subject of old lawsuits. The woman was new and seemed unaware that I was treated like an outsider in that family. She told me, without realizing it, that the office had been handling some emergency transfers to prevent certain heirs from causing trouble later. It wasn't difficult to understand who these certain heirs were. I returned home and made a spreadsheet with all the dates, names, and amounts I had discovered. I used codes, as I taught my students at school, so that no one would understand if they stumbled upon them. On Thursday, Mark showed up at my house asking for help with a computer problem. It was just an excuse to see if I knew anything. I pretended not to understand, poured coffee, listened to the conversation, and noticed him blurt out, "Mom's worried about the will paperwork, says people are trying to take advantage." Every sentence was a clue. Deep down, they were afraid of losing control of the situation. But this time, I wasn't going to make it easy. I went back through everything I had, organized physical and digital folders, and created a dossier to protect myself in case they tried to turn the tables and frame me for some fraud. Within a few days, I had photos of contracts, copies of statements, and recorded conversations via text message. I realized that some of Daniel's signatures had been imitated. It was a simple but serious fraud. If I didn't act quickly, not only would I lose everything, but they could also blame me. Each discovery increased the urgency. I couldn't trust anyone in the house. Daniel, even suspicious, didn't realize the extent of the trouble, so I decided I would do everything myself without telling anyone. I continued smiling at dinners, washing the dishes, listening to jokes, but my mind was elsewhere, connecting dates, names, and calculating the next step. But the more I discovered, the clearer it became that I needed to act fast and alone. With all the files ready, I sat in my living room on a freezing Friday in February and researched for hours until I found a lawyer with no connection to the Henderson family. I chose someone outside their circle, a small neighborhood firm in Kirkland. I called and scheduled an appointment for Monday at 10 in the morning. That night, I barely slept. I reviewed every document, every spreadsheet, spent the night checking to make sure I hadn't left any traces on my home computer, and hid the papers in a grocery bag under my bed, along with some old books. On the appointed day, I walked to the office with the bag and a flash drive. When I entered the lawyer's office, I explained everything: who each person was, how the family's routine worked, where the documents were, and what I thought they were trying to do. He listened quietly, asked few questions, and was direct. He needed discretion and time. He advised me not to confront anyone, not to show nervousness, to carry on as if nothing was happening. He said the evidence was strong, but that people like that always tried to turn things around, to make the victim look guilty. He suggested filing a police report about the suspicious documents and keeping all conversations and screenshots possible. He helped me organize the papers in chronological order, numbering pages, attaching dates, highlighting the fraud, and indicating what would be most important to present if the case ended up in court. I had experienced complicated situations teaching before, but never such a dirty game as that, so I did everything he told me. I spent the next few weeks acting like a theater. I smiled at my mother-in-law, greeted Susan, washed the dishes at their house, and pretended not to hear their jokes, while behind the scenes, I noted every new slip-up. I attached receipts, transfer dates, even old notes that showed I'd been paying attention for some time. Every time I entered my mother-in-law's office, I noted where she kept her keys, how long she was locked inside, who else came in with her. I became nearly invisible, but this time, by choice. Every unspoken phrase was a clue, every joke a chance to pick up more evidence. Daniel suspected nothing. I continued to pretend everything was fine, that the silence was just tiredness. Little by little, I began to notice the change in the atmosphere. Susan became more withdrawn, avoiding leaving me alone near her mother-in-law's office. Mark started calling his mother every day. The grandchildren began asking when their grandmother was going to call the lawyer to settle the matters. The mother-in-law, in turn, became a suspicious shadow, pacing back and forth with papers in her hands, checking her phone, glancing at me more frequently. One day, I heard her whispering to Susan in the kitchen, "This woman is too quiet. I don't like it." I remained cool. I only responded when necessary, offered greetings, but never got involved in the main issues. On February 17th, I found a receipt for the sale of a plot of land in Mark's name, signed without the rest of the family's knowledge. I photographed everything and forwarded it to the lawyer. He urged me to calm down. "Anyone who's right shouldn't rush, Olivia." I kept repeating this phrase every time my anxiety grew. With the material organized, the lawyer began a discreet reporting process. He requested confidentiality from the registry office and informed the police about the possibility of fraud. There was no cause for alarm. Every week, new evidence was added to the dossier. I, in turn, began acting more strategically. Instead of waiting for provocations, I wrote everything down, left copies of messages in a secure cloud, and backed up the files on 2 flash drives, each hidden in a different location. No one noticed a thing. Time passed slowly. Between lunches, I watched the world go by. Susan no longer looked me in the eye. Mark seemed restless, speaking louder than usual. Daniel thought it was just a difficult phase, but I could see it in the small details. Fear was beginning to grow, especially in my mother-in-law. With each passing day, I saw the fear grow in my mother-in-law's eyes. The tables were turning. The day of the meeting arrived on a Saturday in March, with the sky overcast and my mother-in-law's house more crowded than usual. Everyone was called for what she called a final reckoning, but no one knew that the lawyer had already been there since 9 o'clock, talking to me in the back room. I wasn't trembling. I was no longer afraid. I remained silent, sitting next to Daniel, watching my mother-in-law give orders and try to maintain control of the situation. Susan arrived in a new dress. Mark spoke loudly to make himself heard, and even the grandchildren, who were always on their cell phones, seemed attentive. Shortly after 10 o'clock, the lawyer entered the room carrying a gray briefcase, greeted everyone, and asked for silence. He said he had an important announcement to make regarding the division of assets and documents that had reached him in recent months. His mother-in-law tried to interrupt, but he continued, now with the evidence in hand. He began by explaining that I had contacted him to analyze suspicious documents. He showed photos, dates, contracts, and bank statements that until then no one had imagined were in my hands. The room, which was always noisy, fell silent. The lawyer explained every fraud, every irregular transfer, the missing gifts, the forged signatures, and made it clear that records were kept of everything. Within 10 minutes, the mother-in-law's image as an invincible matriarch crumbled. She tried to get up, stammered that it was a lie, tried to blame Daniel, but neither Mark nor Susan could cover up the truth. The grandchildren looked on in alarm. The cousins whispered, unsure where to look. For the first time, no one laughed. No one dared to crack a joke. Daniel stared blankly at the papers. Susan lowered her head. Mark blushed, and the younger members backed away. The lawyer showed the notary's office records, the archived conversations, the hidden sales receipts. He made it clear that, from then on, the courts would closely monitor the entire process, that no one would be allowed to touch anything without accountability. I sat silently, feeling the weight lift from my shoulders. I didn't cry, I didn't make a fuss, I didn't scream. I just took a deep breath and watched my mother-in-law, who always used the force of her voice to humiliate, now completely speechless, staring at the floor as if trying to understand where everything had fallen apart. It was only then that I heard, almost like a whisper, an "I'm sorry" from Mark. Susan approached slowly and apologized, truly looking at her for the first time. The grandchildren, embarrassed, excused themselves from the room. I looked at Daniel, who finally understood what I'd endured all that time. The respect that had never existed appeared in the silence. The mother-in-law, silent, couldn't say anything, but she was the first to leave the room. I stood there, breathing slowly, feeling my dignity slowly return. I hadn't won by yelling, nor with the same venom they'd used on me. I won the moment I let the truth come out. The relief was so great that I allowed myself to smile, even knowing I'd never have a perfect family. In that moment, I understood that revenge, sometimes, is just letting the truth speak for you. After the meeting ended and the house emptied, I sat on the porch, listening to the distant roar of cars and feeling the cold wind on my face. The feeling wasn't of triumph nor revenge, but of a relief I'd never experienced before. It wasn't about defeating my mother-in-law or exposing my family. It was about finally finding myself free from the burden of being belittled and ridiculed, free from the constant fear of doing something wrong, of always being the one to blame. I'd spent years thinking that if I just gave in, things would get better. I spent even more time pretending not to hear insults, avoiding fights, putting my head on my pillow at night, and telling myself that the next day would be different. What happened there, that Saturday, didn't erase the scars of humiliation, but it showed that dignity doesn't depend on the recognition of others. It begins with how we treat ourselves. I didn't need to demean anyone to regain my place. I didn't yell, I didn't point fingers, I didn't turn their pain into a spectacle. I simply delivered what was true and let the rest unfold. I felt proud that I hadn't lost my temper, that I hadn't matched the aggressive tone that hurt me so much. It was the first time in a long time that I'd looked in the mirror without feeling ashamed of what I'd endured in silence. I thought a lot about my mother that day, about her harsh advice, her examples of courage. She always repeated that dignity is something no one can take from us, as long as we don't hand it over to others. I remembered her sitting in the kitchen chair, telling me not to let other people's anger define my worth. And there, on that porch, I truly understood what that meant. I could have yelled, I could have returned every joke in kind, but I decided to act differently. This didn't make me better than anyone else. It just gave me the chance to breathe again, to look at myself without shame. The truth is, nothing I've been through has been easy. There's no magic formula for coming out of situations like this intact. The pain remains, the distrust returns from time to time. But I'm not the same anymore. Today, I no longer accept jokes disguised as advice, nor silence feigned as complicity. I know that the next time someone tries to belittle me, they won't find the same woman as before. I'm no longer afraid of confrontation, but I also don't need the noise to show my strength. If I could go back in time, I'd tell that woman sitting in the kitchen, clutching her napkin and trying not to cry, that she could handle it. I'd tell her it's worth maintaining your dignity, even if no one applauds, because in the end, the only thing we take with us is the truth about who we were. And my truth now is that of someone who survived, not because I was perfect, but because I refused to settle for less than I deserved. Have you ever experienced something like this? What would you do if your own family tried to destroy your reputation? And now, it's your turn to speak. Would you face all this hell in silence, or would you do it differently? Tell us in the comments. What would your reaction have been to an entire family turning their backs and trying to destroy you? Write without fear. Share your story, because your experience could be the push someone needs to find the courage to be on the other side of the screen. Leave it here. I will never let anyone decide who I am, or write your story, no matter how hard it was. This space is for those who are tired of lowering their heads, and you are part of that now. This story resonated with you, because deep down, we all carry some wound inflicted by those who should protect us most. You know what it's like to feel your dignity ripped away in public, and you also know what it's like to rise again, one step at a time. The pain, the anger, the desire to disappear, it's all part of the survival process. Only those who have felt this understand the weight of being discredited, humiliated, and cast aside, and only those who weather this storm discover true strength. Like now, show that you're no longer willing to live in silence. A like is a way of shouting to the world, I exist, I survived, I'm not ashamed of my story. Subscribe to the channel because you're part of this community of survivors, of real people who know the difference between holding back tears and holding their heads high. Here, every story matters. Every detail shared is a light for those who feel alone. Turn on notifications to receive stories that will challenge everything you think about courage, pain, dignity, and starting over. This community grows with each story, with each unfiltered truth. You're already part of this movement. The next video is already on the screen, and believe me, you need to watch it. What's happened so far is just a fragment of what human beings are capable of enduring. But what's coming next will take you even deeper, where not everyone has the courage to go. Click now and come with me, because no one can tell you how far you can go but yourself. And never forget, you survived. Cherish that every day. Don't accept injustice, not even from those who share your surname. Don't let anyone steal your voice. Every word spoken, every story told here is a reminder that you are greater than any lie they tried to make you believe. Send your story. Inspire someone. Be part of this chain. Your pain, your victory, your truth, it all counts. Share, comment, raise the flag of dignity and resilience. Here, no one is alone. The greatest strength you can have is not giving up who you are, even when everything seems lost. Value your life. It's much bigger than any party or hypocritical family.